Interstate 65 stretched like a grey ribbon under the orange sky of a September evening. Jake Thompson adjusted the rearview mirror of his old 1998 Ford pickup, watching the hills of Alabama gradually disappear in the distance. At 19 years old, with brown hair tousled by the wind and blue eyes that sparkled with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation, Jake was finally living the dream he had nurtured for 2 years, attending the country music festival in Nashville, Tennessee. "I can't believe I made it," he murmured to himself, drumming his fingers on the worn steering wheel. The engine's sound rumbled irregularly, constantly reminding him that this trip was a leap of faith. 2 years of working on the Miller farm, saving every penny, turning down invitations to go out with friends, all for this moment. On the passenger seat, carefully folded in a plastic bag, was his best outfit. A blue and white checkered shirt he had bought on clearance, dark jeans, and on the car floor, his only boots, old dark brown work boots that had belonged to his grandfather, William Thompson. Jake stopped at a gas station at the Nashville exit and walked to the restroom to change. The cracked mirror reflected a tall, thin young man with broad shoulders developed through years of manual labor. He put on the shirt carefully, fixed his hair, and lastly, put on his grandfather's boots. The boots told a story of decades of honest work. The leather was worn and yellowed by time, with small scratches and stains that no amount of polish could completely disguise. The soles were unevenly worn, showing evidence of years of walking through plowed fields and muddy corrals. One of the buckles was slightly crooked, and there was a small patch on the right side where the leather had torn years ago. But for Jake, those boots were much more than footwear. They were the connection to the man who taught him about country music, who played guitar on hot summer nights on the house porch, who told him stories about Hank Williams, Johnny Cash, and George Strait while they fixed fences together. "Grandpa always said a man is known by the boots he wears," Jake said to the mirror, remembering Williams' raspy voice. "Work boots show character." 40 minutes later, Nashville's lights began to appear on the horizon. Music City rose like a materialized dream, with its illuminated skyscrapers and the famous guitar shape that decorated some buildings. Jake felt his heart race when he passed the "Welcome to Nashville" sign. Traffic was heavy, typical for a Friday night during the festival. Cars with license plates from different states mixed together. Texas, Mississippi, Georgia, Oklahoma, all converging on the same musical dream. Jake observed other young people in cars beside him, many wearing clearly new and expensive clothes, immaculate cowboy hats, and boots that gleamed under the city lights. Finding parking near Nissan Stadium was a challenge that cost another $30. Money Jake had reserved for food, but now saw as a necessary investment. He walked through the crowded streets, absorbing every sound, every smell, every sight that Nashville offered. Street musicians played on corners, the aroma of barbecue and beer hung in the air, and animated conversations about music echoed everywhere. "First time at the festival?" asked a middle-aged woman with a Texas accent, noticing Jake's amazed expression. "Yes, ma'am. I came from Alabama especially for this." "How wonderful, honey. Enjoy every second. These moments stay in your memory forever." Jake smiled and continued walking. He arrived at the festival's main gate at 6:30 p.m., exactly when activities began. The crowd was impressive. Thousands of people dressed in the best of country style, creating a sea of hats, fringes, gleaming boots, and belts with elaborate buckles. It was then that Jake noticed something he hadn't considered in his 2 years of planning. He was clearly different. As he observed the other participants, he realized that his clothes, despite being clean and well cared for, seemed too simple. More importantly, his old boots stood out negatively amid a sea of new and expensive footwear. A group of young people his age passed by him, and Jake heard fragments of conversation about custom Justin boots worth $1,200 and authentic Stetson hats. He looked down at his own boots and for the first time felt a pang of insecurity, but he quickly composed himself. "I didn't come here for fashion," he murmured to himself. "I came for the music." Jake headed to the box office to pick up his VIP ticket, a luxury he had allowed himself after months of weekend overtime work. The ticket had cost almost half of his savings, but guaranteed access to special areas, meet and greet with some artists, and the opportunity to be closer to the main stage. "Name?" asked the attendant, a young blonde with a professional smile. "Jake Thompson." She typed on the computer and frowned. "Here it is, VIP ticket for Section A. Do you have ID?" Jake showed his Alabama driver's license. The attendant looked him up and down, her eyes visibly stopping at the worn boots. "Everything's in order," she said, handing him the ticket with a golden wristband. "Have fun!" Jake tied the wristband on his wrist as if it were a medal of honor. Finally, after 2 years of dreams and savings, he was inside the Nashville Country Music Festival. The sound of the first band echoed through the speakers, a perfect mixture of guitars, banjos, and harmonious voices that made Jake's heart race. He closed his eyes for a moment, remembering his grandfather playing the same melodies on the house porch. "I made it, Grandpa," he whispered. "I'm here." He couldn't imagine that in the next few hours, his old work boots would be the center of a situation that would change not only his life, but touch the heart of a country music legend and everyone who witnessed what was about to come. The VIP section was located in an elevated area with a privileged view of the main stage. Jake climbed the wooden stairs, feeling simultaneously excited and nervous. The golden wristband on his wrist gave him access to a world he had always imagined only from afar. Premium bars, cushioned seats, private restrooms, and most importantly, proximity to the big names in country music. Upon reaching the top of the stairs, Jake was greeted by 2 uniformed security guards. The first, a robust man of approximately 40 years named Marcus Sullivan, wore a black shirt with "security" printed in white letters. His partner, Derek Johnson, was younger, around 30, with muscular arms and a serious expression. "Good evening, can I see your wristband?" asked Marcus, courteously but professionally. Jake extended his arm, proudly showing the golden wristband. Marcus examined it with a small flashlight, checking the security holograms. "Everything's in order," said Marcus, but his hesitation was noticeable. His eyes had fixed on Jake's boots, and he exchanged a questioning look with Derek. "You can pass," said Derek, but his tone carried a note of distrust. Jake entered the VIP area and immediately felt out of place. The contrast was even more striking there than in the general area. Men wore tailored cowboy suits. Women wore party dresses with high-heeled boots that probably cost more than Jake earned in a month. Conversations revolved around business, investments, and connections in the music industry. He found a space near the fence that separated the VIP area from the stage and settled in, trying to ignore the curious looks. The first band was finishing their set, and the announcer announced a 20-minute break before the next performance. It was during this break that Jake met Bradley Whitman III, a young man his age, son of a Nashville music industry executive. Bradley wore an impeccable outfit: black Stetson hat, navy blue silk western shirt, leather pants, and Tony Lama boots that looked like they had come straight from a luxury store display. "Dude, are you lost?" Bradley asked, approaching Jake with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I think the general area is down there." "I have a VIP ticket," Jake replied, showing the wristband. Bradley looked at the wristband, then at Jake's clothes, and finally his eyes fixed on the worn boots. "Seriously? How did you get that?" "I bought it like anyone else," Jake said, beginning to feel uncomfortable with the tone of the conversation. "Of course," Bradley laughed, But tell me something, buddy. Did you come straight from the farm? Because those boots look like they've stepped in a lot of cow manure. Other young people from the VIP area began to approach, drawn by the conversation. Jake recognized the type. Children of executives, owners of smaller record labels, influencers from the country scene with thousands of followers, all impeccably dressed, all with that air of superiority that money and connections provide. "Let me see those boots up close," said Madison Parker, a young influencer with platinum blonde hair and over 200,000 Instagram followers. She pointed her phone at Jake's feet. "Oh my God, guys, you have to see this. These boots are vintage, like way too vintage." "They're not vintage," Jake defended himself. "They belong to my grandfather." "Your grandfather?" Bradley laughed. "Dude, that's even worse. You're wearing dead man's boots?" The group exploded in cruel laughter. Jake felt his face heat up, a mixture of anger and humiliation rising in his throat. "My grandfather was a hard-working man," Jake said, trying to maintain his dignity. "He wore these boots for more than 30 years. "And it really shows," commented Austin Reed, another group member filming with his phone. "Dude, this is going to go viral. Young man shows up at festival with boots from the last century." Madison continued filming, making exaggerated expressions of disgust. "This is honestly sad. Like, couldn't you at least buy some cheap boots from Walmart? These look like they came from a thrift store." "In 1985, maybe we should call security," suggested Bradley with mock concern. "I mean, are we sure this ticket is real? How does someone wearing that afford VIP?" Jake felt the walls closing in around him. More people from the VIP area were gathering, drawn by the commotion. Some were openly laughing, others were filming, and a few looked uncomfortable but said nothing. "Listen, farm boy," Bradley continued, his voice getting louder and more aggressive. "This is a classy event. We have standards here. Maybe you'd be more comfortable with the regular folk down there." "I paid for my ticket just like everyone else," Jake said, his voice trembling slightly but firm. "I have every right to be here." "Rights?" Madison laughed, still filming. "Honey, just because you can afford something doesn't mean you belong. Look around. Do you see anyone else dressed like they just finished milking cows?" The humiliation was becoming unbearable. Jake noticed that even some adults in the VIP area were watching with amusement rather than intervening. He felt completely alone, surrounded by a sea of hostile faces and pointing phones. "Those boots are honestly disgusting," said Chloe Martinez, another young influencer who had joined the group. "Like the smell alone. Can everyone else smell that? It's like barnyard mixed with I don't even know what." Jake looked down at his grandfather's boots. In that moment, they seemed to represent everything he was ashamed of. His humble background, his lack of money, his outsider status in this world of privilege and connections. But then he remembered his grandfather's words. "A man is known by the boots he wears. Work boots show character." "My grandfather was worth 10 of any of you," Jake said quietly, but with unexpected strength in his voice. "These boots represent honest work, something most of you have probably never done." "Oh, how touching," Bradley mocked. "The poor farm boy is getting emotional about his dead grandfather's dirty boots." It was at that moment that Marcus Sullivan, the security guard, approached the group. Jake's heart sank, assuming he was about to be escorted out. "Is there a problem here?" Marcus asked, looking directly at Jake. "Yes, actually," Bradley said quickly. "This guy doesn't belong in the VIP area. I mean, look at him. Those boots are a health hazard." Marcus looked at Jake's boots, then at his wristband. "Sir, can I see your ticket receipt?" Jake fumbled in his pocket and pulled out the crumpled receipt. Marcus examined it carefully, then looked at Jake with an expression that was hard to read. "The ticket is legitimate," Marcus announced. "He has every right to be here." "But come on, man," Derek Johnson, the other security guard, said quietly to Marcus. "Look at him. He's clearly out of place." Maybe we should suggest he'd be more comfortable in general admission. Jake felt his heart breaking. Even the security guards, who were supposed to be neutral, were taking sides against him. The crowd of young people around him sensed victory and became bolder. "See, even security agrees," Madison said triumphantly. "This is embarrassing for everyone involved." "I think you should leave," Bradley said, stepping closer to Jake. "Save yourself further embarrassment." Jake stood there, surrounded by hostile faces, phones recording his humiliation, feeling smaller and more alone than he had ever felt in his life. The golden wristband on his arm that had felt like a badge of honor now felt like a mockery. His grandfather's boots, which had carried him through 2 years of hard work and dreams, now felt like anchors, dragging him down. He was about to turn and leave, when a voice cut through the crowd like a knife through silence. "What the hell is going on here?" Everyone turned to see a man in his 70s approaching, wearing simple jeans, a plain white shirt, and well-worn but quality boots. His presence was magnetic, commanding immediate attention despite his understated appearance. There was something familiar about him, but in the dim evening light and amid the chaos, most people didn't immediately recognize who he was. Jake's humiliation was about to take an unexpected turn that would change not only his life, but the lives of everyone witnessing this moment. The voice that cut through the hostile crowd belonged to George Harvey Strait Sr., though at first few people recognized the man walking toward them. At 71 years old, George Strait moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove to anyone. His silver hair was neatly combed, his face weathered by years of authentic living, and his eyes held the wisdom of someone who had seen both the best and worst of human nature. He wasn't dressed like the other VIP guests. No flashy cowboy costume, no expensive designer wear. Just well-fitted Wrangler jeans, a simple white cotton shirt, and a pair of brown leather boots that, while quality-made, showed the honest wear of a man who actually walked in them. On his wrist was a simple watch, and the only jewelry he wore was a plain gold wedding band that had been there for over 40 years. "I asked what's going on here," George repeated, his voice calm but carrying an authority that made everyone fall silent. Bradley Whitman III was the first to recover, puffing up his chest with the confidence of someone accustomed to intimidating others with his family connections. "Sir, we're just pointing out that this guy," he gestured dismissively at Jake, "doesn't really belong in the VIP area. I mean, look at those boots. It's honestly embarrassing for everyone involved." George's eyes moved slowly from Bradley to Jake, taking in the scene. He noticed the phone's recording, the circle of young people with expressions ranging from amusement to cruelty, and in the center, a young man who looked like he wanted the earth to swallow him whole. "And you are?" George asked Bradley, his tone neutral, but somehow making the question sound like a challenge. "Bradley Whitman III. My father is Richard Whitman. He runs Pinnacle Records. We're basically Nashville royalty." Bradley's tone was dripping with entitlement. "Ah," George nodded slowly. "And you think that gives you the right to humiliate someone?" "Humiliate?" Madison Parker jumped in, still holding her phone up to record. "We're just pointing out the obvious. This guy walked into the VIP section wearing boots that belong in a barn. It's honestly disrespectful to everyone who paid good money to be here." George turned his attention to Jake, who was standing with his head down, clearly wishing he could disappear. "What's your name, son?" "Jake Thompson, sir, from Alabama." "And those boots you're wearing?" Jake looked up for the first time, meeting George's eyes. There was something in the older man's gaze that made him feel like he could speak honestly. "They were my grandfather's, sir. William Thompson. He wore them for over 30 years working cattle and crops. He passed away 2 years ago." George nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Work boots. Real ones by the look of them." "Sir, with all due respect," Derek Johnson, the security guard, interjected, "maybe we should move this conversation somewhere more private. There are other VIP guests who might be uncomfortable with the situation. George's eyes flashed dangerously as he turned to Derek. Uncomfortable with what exactly? Derek shifted nervously. Well, I mean standards, appearance, you know. No, I don't know. Explain it to me. The security guard looked increasingly uncomfortable under George's steady gaze. It's just that the VIP area has certain expectations. About footwear? George's voice was deceptively quiet. Meanwhile, some of the adults in the VIP area had begun to recognize who was speaking. Whispers started spreading through the crowd. Is that? It can't be. Oh my God, that's George Strait. Bradley, however, was still oblivious and becoming more aggressive. Look, old man, I don't know who you think you are, but this doesn't concern you. We're just trying to maintain some class in this area. Class! George repeated the word slowly, as if tasting something bitter. He looked around at the circle of young people, all designer-dressed, all holding expensive phones, all united in their cruelty toward one person who dared to be different. Son, George said to Bradley, what do you know about country music? Everything, Bradley replied confidently. I've grown up in this industry. My family practically built Nashville. Then tell me what country music is really about. Bradley looked confused by the question. It's about success, tradition, the American dream. Is it? George's voice remained calm, but there was something building beneath the surface. Let me tell you what I think country music is about. It's about real people, real struggles, real work. It's about a man coming home after 16 hours in the fields, sitting on his porch with a guitar and singing about his life. It's about honesty, humility, and respect for those who work hard to make their dreams come true. He paused, looking directly at Jake. It's about a young man who saves every penny for 2 years, drives 8 hours in an old pickup truck, and has the courage to chase his dreams, even when he knows he doesn't fit in with the crowd. Madison was still recording, but her smug expression was beginning to falter. But standards matter. Image matters. This is a high-end event. You want to talk about image? George's voice was getting stronger now. Let me tell you about image. Real country artists, the ones who built this music, they came from farms, small towns, broken homes. They wore work clothes because that's what they had. They sang about real life because that's what they lived. He gestured toward Jake's boots. Those boots have more authenticity than all of your designer costumes combined. They represent something you clearly don't understand: honest work, family legacy, and the courage to honor where you come from. By now, more people had recognized George Strait, and word was spreading rapidly through the VIP area. The king of country music himself was defending the young man these privileged kids had been humiliating. Cell phones that had been pointed at Jake in mockery were now being pointed at George in awe. Marcus Sullivan, the senior security guard, finally realized who he was dealing with. His face went pale as he understood the magnitude of what had been happening. Mr. Strait, Marcus said quietly, I had no idea you were here tonight. That's obvious, George replied dryly. Otherwise, I hope you would have handled this situation differently. He turned back to Jake, who was staring at him with a mixture of disbelief and growing recognition. Jake Thompson from Alabama, tell me about your grandfather. Jake's voice was shaky, but grew stronger as he spoke. He raised cattle and grew corn and soybeans, worked from dawn to dusk every day of his life, never made much money, but he always said a man's worth isn't measured by what he owns, but by how hard he works and how he treats other people. And he liked country music. Yes, sir. He had an old guitar, and he'd play Hank Williams, Johnny Cash, Merle Haggard. Jake paused, looking directly at George. And George Strait. You were his favorite, sir. He said you sang about real life, not fantasy. George smiled for the first time since approaching the group. What was his favorite song? Amarillo Morning. He said it reminded him of his own youth, working cattle drives in Texas before he settled in Alabama. The crowd around them had grown silent. The cruel laughter had died, replaced by an uncomfortable recognition that they had been exposed for exactly what they were. Privileged kids with no understanding of the values that country music was supposed to represent. "Bradley Whitman III," George said, turning back to the young man who had started this confrontation. "Your father runs Pinnacle Records?" "Yes, sir," Bradley replied, his earlier confidence evaporating as he finally realized who he was talking to. "I know your father, good businessman. I wonder what he would think about his son humiliating a young man for wearing his grandfather's work boots to a country music festival." Bradley's face went white. "Sir, you were just being cruel to someone you perceived as beneath you. You were just showing everyone here what happens when money and connections replace character and values." George looked around at the entire group. "Every single one of you should be ashamed. This young man saved for 2 years to be here. He drove 8 hours in an old truck, probably spent half his savings on that VIP ticket, and he did it all to honor the music his grandfather taught him to love. And you repaid his passion and dedication with mockery and humiliation." The silence was deafening. Some of the young people were starting to back away, suddenly realizing that their hilarious videos might not look so funny when shared with the world, especially now that they had been called out by the king of country music himself. Madison Parker, the influencer, finally lowered her phone. "Mr. Strait, we didn't mean anything by it. We were just having fun." "Fun," George repeated. "You were having fun humiliating someone. Let me ask you something, young lady. What do you contribute to country music? What do you bring to this community besides your ability to mock others?" Madison had no answer. George turned back to Jake, and his voice became gentle again. "Son, don't you let anyone make you ashamed of those boots or where you came from. Your grandfather would be proud to see you here, honoring the music he loved." What happened next would be talked about for years to come, shared millions of times on social media, and become one of the most famous moments in country music festival history. George Strait, the legend himself, was about to make a gesture that would change Jake Thompson's life forever and teach everyone present a lesson they would never forget. George Strait looked down at his own boots, then back at Jake's weathered work boots, and something in his expression shifted. The anger was still there, directed at the crowd of privileged kids who had been tormenting Jake, but when he looked at the young man from Alabama, his eyes held something else entirely: recognition, respect, and a deep understanding of what those boots represented. "Jake," George said quietly, "I want you to know something. Some of the greatest country music artists who ever lived wore boots just like those. Hank Williams wore work boots. So did Johnny Cash, Merle Haggard, and Waylon Jennings. Those boots don't make you less worthy of being here. They make you exactly the kind of person country music was created for." The crowd around them had grown significantly. Word had spread throughout the VIP area that George Strait was involved in some kind of confrontation, and people were pushing closer to see what was happening. Many were recording with their phones, but now the tone was completely different. Instead of mockery, there was anticipation, a sense that they were witnessing something important. "In fact," George continued, his voice carrying clearly through the evening air, "I think those boots tell a better story than anything else I've seen here tonight. They tell the story of honest work, family legacy, and the courage to honor where you come from." He paused, looking around at the gathered crowd, before making a decision that would become legendary in country music folklore. "Jake Thompson," George said formally, "I would be honored if you would be my personal guest for the rest of the evening." The crowd erupted in whispers and gasps. Bradley Whitman III looked like he had been slapped, while Madison Parker and her friends stared in disbelief. Marcus Sullivan and Derek Johnson exchanged glances that clearly said they realized they had made a terrible mistake. "Sir, Jake stammered, clearly overwhelmed. "No, sir, necessary," George smiled. "Just George. And I mean it. I want you to watch the show from the side stage area, as my guest." But George wasn't finished. He turned to address the security guards who had been so quick to suggest that Jake didn't belong. "Marcus Sullivan and Derek Johnson," he said, reading their name tags. "I understand you were considering asking this young man to leave." Both guards looked uncomfortable. Marcus cleared his throat. "Mr. Strait, we were just trying to maintain the standards of the VIP area." "Standards," George repeated. "Let me tell you about standards. A real man's standards aren't measured by the cost of his boots or the designer label on his shirt. They're measured by his character, his work ethic, and how he treats other people. By those standards, Jake Thompson has shown more class tonight than anyone who was attacking him." Derek Johnson tried to defend their actions. "Sir, we were just responding to complaints from other VIP guests." "Were you?" George's voice turned cold again. "Or were you making judgments based on appearances? Because let me tell you something about appearances. I've seen men in $1,000 suits who couldn't carry a tune or write an honest lyric to save their lives. And I've seen men in work clothes who had more music in their hearts than half the Nashville scene combined." He gestured toward Jake. "This young man drove 8 hours and spent his savings to be here because he loves the music. That's more than I can say for most of the people in this VIP area, who are probably here because their parents bought them tickets or because they're trying to make business connections." The truth of George's words was evident in the uncomfortable shifting of the crowd. Many of the VIP guests were exactly what he described: people with connections rather than passion, money rather than understanding. "Furthermore," George continued, addressing the security guards, "if you had bothered to listen to what was happening, instead of making assumptions based on this young man's appearance, you would have realized that he was being bullied and humiliated. Your job is supposed to be protecting people, not enabling their tormentors." Marcus Sullivan's face was red with embarrassment. "Mr. Strait, you're absolutely right. We handled this completely wrong." "Yes, you did," George agreed. "And you're going to make it right. I want both of you to apologize to Jake Thompson, not because I'm telling you to, but because it's the right thing to do." Both security guards turned to Jake, their earlier dismissive attitudes completely gone. "Mr. Thompson," Marcus said formally, "I sincerely apologize for my unprofessional behavior tonight. You had every right to be in the VIP area, and I should have protected you from harassment instead of contributing to it." Derek nodded in agreement. "I'm sorry too, sir. We were wrong to judge you based on your appearance. That goes against everything we're supposed to stand for as security professionals." Jake, still somewhat stunned by the turn of events, nodded graciously. "Thank you both. I appreciate that." But George wasn't finished addressing the crowd. He turned to Bradley Whitman III, who had been trying to edge away from the group without being noticed. "Bradley!" George called out, stopping the young man in his tracks. "Come here!" Bradley reluctantly approached, his earlier arrogance completely deflated. "I'm going to give you some free advice," George said. "Your father has built a successful business in this industry, but success in country music isn't just about money and connections. It's about understanding and respecting the people who make the music and the fans who support it. Tonight, you showed everyone here that you understand neither." "Mr. Strait, I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did mean it," George interrupted. "You meant every word of it. You looked at Jake and saw someone you thought was beneath you, someone you could humiliate for your own entertainment. That attitude will destroy you in this business if you don't change it." He paused, letting the words sink in. Country music fans are real people. They work hard for their money. They drive long distances to hear the music they love, and they deserve respect. If you can't give them that respect, you have no business being part of this industry. Madison Parker, who had been recording the entire confrontation, finally found her voice. "Mr. Strait, I want to apologize too. We were completely out of line." George looked at her phone, which was still recording. "Are you planning to post that video?" I don't know. I wasn't sure." "Let me make a suggestion," George said. "Instead of posting a video that shows you and your friends bullying someone, why don't you think about posting something that might actually contribute positively to the country music community? Maybe use your platform to promote respect and inclusion instead of mockery and exclusion." Madison nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. You're absolutely right." George then did something that surprised everyone. He sat down on a nearby bench and gestured for Jake to join him. "Tell me about your grandfather's guitar," George said, his voice returning to the gentle tone he had used when first speaking to Jake. Jake sat down, still overwhelmed by everything that had happened. It was an old Martin acoustic, probably from the 1960s. He bought it used when he was young, and he played it almost every evening on the porch. "He taught me a few chords, but I was never as good as he was." "What songs did he teach you?" "Your Cheatin' Heart," "I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry," "Friends in Low Places," and "Amarillo Morning." George smiled. "Good songs, real songs. Your grandfather had good taste. He always said that real country music tells stories about real life. He said that's why he loved your music so much, because you sang about things that mattered to regular people." "Your grandfather was a wise man," George said, "and he raised a good grandson. Don't you ever let anyone make you ashamed of who you are or where you come from." By this time, the confrontation had attracted the attention of festival organizers and media personnel. Several people with official badges were approaching, including Rebecca Martinez, the festival's head of public relations, and Thomas Anderson, the event coordinator. "Mr. Strait," Rebecca said breathlessly, "we had no idea you were here tonight. Is everything all right?" George stood up and his expression became serious again. "Everything is decidedly not all right, Rebecca. I just witnessed a young man being humiliated and nearly thrown out of an area he had paid to access, simply because his boots weren't expensive enough for some of your other guests." Rebecca looked alarmed. "Sir, if there was an incident involving security or guest services, we need to investigate immediately." "Oh, there was definitely an incident," George said. "And it says something very troubling about the culture you're allowing to develop at this festival." Thomas Anderson stepped forward. "Mr. Strait, we take any allegations of mistreatment very seriously. We want all of our guests to feel welcome and respected." "Do you?" George asked pointedly, "because what I just witnessed suggests otherwise. This young man," he gestured to Jake, "was mocked, humiliated, and nearly ejected by your security staff, all because he doesn't fit someone's idea of what a VIP guest should look like." Rebecca and Thomas exchanged concerned glances. They both understood that having George Strait publicly criticize their festival would be a public relations disaster. "What can we do to make this right?" Rebecca asked. George looked at Jake, then back at the festival officials. "First, you can make sure this never happens again. Create policies that protect guests from harassment and train your staff to treat everyone with respect, regardless of their appearance. Second, you can use this as a learning opportunity to remember what country music is really about." "Absolutely," Thomas nodded vigorously. "We'll implement new protocols immediately." "Good," George said. "Because country music is supposed to be inclusive. It's supposed to be about real people living real lives, not about excluding someone because their boots have seen honest work." What happened next would become the stuff of legend, shared millions of times across social media and talked about for years to come. George Strait was about to make a gesture that would not only change Jake Thompson's life forever, but would also send a message to the entire country music community about what really matters. George Strait looked thoughtfully at Jake Thompson, then at the crowd that had gathered around them. The young man from Alabama sat quietly, still processing everything that had happened in the last hour. His grandfather's worn boots, which had been the source of such cruel mockery, now seemed to carry a different weight. not of shame, but of honor. "Jake," George said, standing up from the bench, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Do you play guitar?" "A little, sir. My grandfather taught me some basic chords, but I'm not very good." "Not very good by whose standards?" George asked with a slight smile. "By the standards of someone who thinks music is about expensive equipment and perfect technique, or by the standards of someone who understands that music comes from the heart?" Jake thought for a moment. "I can play well enough to honor the songs my grandfather taught me. That's all that matters," George nodded. "Music isn't about perfection, it's about truth, emotion, and connection." George then did something that stunned everyone present. He turned to Thomas Anderson, the event coordinator, and said, "Thomas, I want to make a change to tonight's program." "Of course, Mr. Strait, whatever you need." "I want Jake Thompson to join me on stage." The crowd erupted in gasps and murmurs. Jake's face went white with shock. "Mr. Strait, I don't. There are thousands of people out there, and every single one of them needs to hear this story," George said firmly. "They need to understand what country music really represents. They need to see that it's not about designer clothes or expensive boots. It's about real people, real experiences, and real connections." Rebecca Martinez looked concerned. "Mr. Strait, with all due respect, we have insurance considerations, union requirements." George's expression made it clear he wasn't interested in bureaucratic obstacles. "Rebecca, I've been performing for over 4 decades. I think I can handle the logistics of bringing one guest on stage. The question is whether this festival is going to support the values that country music was built on, or whether it's going to continue enabling the kind of behavior we just witnessed." Thomas Anderson quickly intervened. "Of course we'll support this, Mr. Strait. Whatever you need, we'll make it happen." George turned back to Jake. "I'm not asking you to perform. I'm asking you to help me tell a story. Will you do that?" Jake looked around at the faces surrounding him. Some showed curiosity, others admiration, and a few still held traces of the contempt that had started this whole situation. But when he looked at George Strait, he saw only genuine respect and encouragement. "If you think it would help," Jake said quietly, "then yes, sir." "It will help," George assured him. "It will help everyone here remember why we're all supposed to be here in the first place." Word spread quickly through the festival that George Strait was not only performing, but was bringing a special guest on stage. The story of what had happened in the VIP area had already begun circulating, and anticipation was building throughout the venue. As they prepared to head toward the stage area, George stopped and addressed the group of young people who had tormented Jake earlier. Bradley Whitman III, Madison Parker, Austin Reed, and the others stood uncomfortably, clearly wishing they could disappear. "I want all of you to stay and watch," George said. "This is your education. This is your chance to learn what you should have known all along." He then turned to Marcus Sullivan and Derek Johnson, the security guards. "I want you two to personally escort Jake backstage and make sure he's treated with the respect he should have received from the beginning." "Absolutely, Mr. Strait," Marcus said immediately. "It would be our honor." As they walked toward the stage area, George continued talking to Jake. "Tell me about your job back in Alabama." "I work on the Miller farm, cattle mostly, some crops. It's hard work, but I like it. There's something honest about it, you know? At the end of the day, you can see what you've accomplished." "Your grandfather would be proud of that attitude," George said. "And he'd be proud of what you're about to do." "I'm scared," Jake admitted. "I've never been on stage before. I've never even spoken in front of more than a few people." "Fear is normal," George said. "But remember, you're not representing yourself up there. You're representing everyone who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong, everyone who's ever been judged for their appearance instead of their character, everyone who loves this music for the right reasons." They reached the backstage area where George's road crew was preparing for his set. The crew members, seasoned professionals who had seen everything in their decades of touring, looked curiously at Jake but welcomed him warmly once George explained the situation. "This is Jake Thompson," George announced to his band and crew. "He's going to help me tell an important story tonight." Mark Stevens, George's longtime guitar player, approached Jake with genuine interest. "Nice to meet you, Jake. Those are some serious work boots you've got there." "Thank you, sir. They were my grandfather's." "Well, they've got character," Mark said approvingly. "That's more than you can say for most of the footwear around here." As showtime approached, George gathered his band and explained what he wanted to do. "We're going to tell the story of what happened tonight, and we're going to remind everyone what country music is really about. This isn't about putting on a show. This is about getting back to the truth." The crowd at Nissan Stadium was massive. Over 65,000 people packed into the venue, with thousands more watching the live stream. When George Strait took the stage, the roar was deafening. He was, after all, the king of country music, with more #1 hits than any artist in history. George performed several of his classic songs first, getting the crowd warmed up and engaged. But then he stopped and moved to the microphone at center stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice carried clearly through the stadium, "I want to tell you about something that happened here tonight. Something that reminded me why I fell in love with country music in the first place, and something that should remind all of us what this music is really about." The crowd quieted, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "A little while ago, I met a young man named Jake Thompson. Jake drove 8 hours from Alabama to be here tonight. He saved for 2 years to afford a VIP ticket, and he came here to honor the memory of his grandfather, who taught him to love country music." George paused, looking out at the sea of faces. But when Jake got here, some people decided he didn't belong. They decided that because his boots weren't expensive enough, because his clothes weren't designer labels, because he looked like he actually worked for a living, he didn't deserve to be treated with respect. A murmur went through the crowd. George could see people turning to each other, talking about what they were hearing. "Now, I want to ask all of you something," George continued. "What do you think country music is about? Is it about having the most expensive boots? Is it about designer clothes and perfect appearances? Or is it about something else entirely?" The crowd responded with cheers and applause, though it was clear many weren't sure where this was going. "I'll tell you what I think it's about," George said. "It's about real people, real stories, real life. It's about a farmer coming home after a long day and finding comfort in a song. It's about a single mother working 2 jobs and finding strength in music that understands her struggles. It's about a young man who honors his grandfather's memory by wearing his work boots and refusing to be ashamed of where he comes from." The applause was growing stronger now. "Jake Thompson," George called out, "come on out here." Jake emerged from the wings, and the sight of him, young, nervous, wearing his simple clothes and weathered boots, created a stark contrast to the polished perfection that usually graced such stages. But there was something authentic about him that the crowd immediately recognized and responded to. "Ladies and gentlemen," George said, putting his arm around Jake's shoulders, "this is what country music looks like. This is who it's for. Not for people who use it as a costume or a fashion statement, but for people who live it, who understand it, who carry it in their hearts." The crowd was on its feet now, cheering not just for George Strait, but for Jake Thompson and what he represented. "Jake," George said, turning to the young man, "tell these people about your grandfather." Jake approached the microphone nervously, but when he began to speak, his voice carried clearly through the stadium. "My grandfather, William Thompson, worked every day of his life," Jake said. "He raised cattle, grew crops, and never made much money. But every evening he'd sit on our porch with an old guitar and play the songs he loved. He taught me that music isn't about being perfect. It's about being honest." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. He used to say that a man is known by the boots he wears, and that work boots show character. These boots, Jake looked down at his feet. They walked through fields and barns for 30 years. They represent everything my grandfather believed in: hard work, honesty, and never being ashamed of who you are. The applause that followed was unlike anything Jake had ever heard. 65,000 people expressing their approval, not for a polished performance, but for simple, honest truth. George stepped back to the microphone. Tonight, some people tried to make Jake ashamed of those boots. They tried to make him feel like he didn't belong here. But I want to tell you something. He belongs here more than anyone, because he understands what this music is really about. George then made an announcement that would be remembered as one of the most significant moments in country music history. "Jake Thompson," he said, "I want to offer you something. I want to invite you to be my guest at every show on my farewell tour. I want you to travel with us, to meet the fans, to see how this music touches real people's lives. And I want you to remind everyone you meet that country music belongs to people like you, people who work hard, who value family, who understand that character matters more than appearance." The crowd erupted in the loudest cheer of the night. Jake stood there, tears streaming down his face, overwhelmed by the generosity and kindness of this man he had idolized from afar. But George wasn't finished, and to everyone in this stadium, everyone watching at home, everyone who loves country music, I want you to remember tonight. I want you to remember that when you see someone who doesn't look like they belong, maybe they're exactly the person who belongs the most. When you see work boots instead of designer boots, maybe you're looking at someone who understands real life better than anyone in a $1,000 outfit. He paused, looking out at the massive crowd. Country music was built by people like Jake's grandfather. It was built by farmers, factory workers, truck drivers, waitresses, and everyone else who works hard and dreams big. Don't ever let anyone convince you that it belongs to anyone else. The rest of George's performance that night was magical, but it was the moment with Jake Thompson that would be remembered forever. Videos of the encounter went viral immediately, shared millions of times across social media platforms. But more importantly, it started a conversation about values, respect, and what country music really represents. In the weeks that followed, Jake did indeed join George Strait's farewell tour. He met thousands of fans, heard countless stories of how the music had touched their lives, and came to understand that his grandfather's love for country music was part of something much larger than he had ever imagined. Bradley Whitman III, Madison Parker, and the others who had humiliated Jake found themselves on the receiving end of public criticism. But rather than simply being cancelled or condemned, several of them used the experience as a wake-up call. Bradley eventually wrote a public apology and began working with organizations that promote inclusion in the music industry. Marcus Sullivan and Derek Johnson, the security guards, also learned from the experience. They implemented new training protocols for their company, focusing on treating all guests with respect, regardless of appearance or perceived status. But perhaps the most important legacy of that night was the message it sent to country music fans everywhere. Jake Thompson's story became a symbol of the genre's true values, that authenticity matters more than appearance, that hard work deserves respect, and that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity. Years later, Jake would often be asked about that night in Nashville. He would tell people that the most important thing wasn't that George Strait defended him or that he got to travel on the farewell tour. The most important thing was that his grandfather's boots and everything they represented were finally given the respect they deserved. And in country music venues across America, you began to see more work boots and fewer designer boots, more honest clothes and fewer costumes, more real people and fewer pretenders. because Jake Thompson and George Strait had reminded everyone what country music was really supposed to be about. The story of that night became legendary, but its true impact was measured not in views or shares, but in the countless individuals who felt empowered to be themselves, to honor their heritage, and to never be ashamed of honest work and humble beginnings. In the end, Jake Thompson's grandfather had been right all along. A man is known by the boots he wears, and work boots do indeed show character. Sometimes it just takes a legend to help everyone else see what should have been obvious from the beginning.